Look, people, there's been a lot of talk lately about America's geopolitical rivalries, and there is frequent talk of a new Cold War. Whether we live in such an era is, at the very least, debatable. But the fact that such terminology is being thrown about perhaps reveals something about the way politicos think about the wider international environment. The Cold War was, to be sure, serious in nature, but it has also become an increasingly hazy historical period for many. The central role it played in international politics, its constant presence as a series of threats hanging over all means of domestic politics. The Cold War was the stuff of many action-packed spy thrillers, while also fueling our post-apocalyptic speculations around the threat of nuclear war. To take these recent warnings seriously, we at Angry Verklemmt think it's worth reminiscing a bit on the original Cold War. We want to highlight what this battle of superpower rivalries was, and why it might still matter today. But there is also the matter of its nefarious use. Invoking the Cold War inevitably serves political purposes, and we do well to keep this in mind. So join us on Angry Verklemmt as we consider the potential impacts of a now bygone era, and we try to make sense of the present in that light. All right, here we are. How you doing?
Good. You got a little bit blurry. Have you noticed? Sorry.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, but it's okay. It'll come back on the screen. Yeah, you're a little bit. Yeah,
Okay.
there we go. It's okay. Well, everybody knows who Roddy is.
Everybody knows who I am. I'm in an undisclosed location, thus my beautiful theme map for the day.
You know, as long as you're not holding up newspapers with the date on them, that's the only thing I need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would truly be an undisclosed location.
I don't even know if people, like young people, will catch that, man. That's what they used to do back in the olden days when they kidnapped somebody, and you couldn't get the dates like on pictures. So
Yeah,
they would
sure,
let you
of
hold
course,
up like
yeah.
the day's paper. Yeah. So
Yeah, with your Stockholm syndrome. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Just to make another reference to the past. So here we are. We're going to talk today about the Cold War and whether we're in a new Cold War, to put it in a very plain, simplistic fashion. I wanted to start today by playing up another one of my multimedia extravaganzas here. I prepared a little mashup just to set the scene about the way the U.S. media is handling this topic of a new Cold War. So I'm going to play that, and then we'll get to discussing it, establishing the problem on the other side.
But we're not seeking, say it again, we are not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocks.
Today, the Cold War echoes through the war between Ukraine and Russia. Espionage, propaganda, and election meddling were hallmarks of the conflict with the former Soviet Union. But as Lisa Fletcher found out, what's old is new again in growing tensions between the U.S. and Russia.
Calder Walton studies the past and present of interference tactics here at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government.
There are echoes of a new Cold War right now between the West and Russia. And a lot of the tradecraft that was pioneered in the 1950s and 60s about spies and spying, espionage and counter-espionage is still very active today.
How hot do you think this Cold War is, first of all? How severe do you think these tensions are between the two countries?
Good to be here. So the Cold War, I guess it's been almost a decade that it's softly been continuing. In 2015, it was started to accelerate. The last couple of years, it's come front and center. And I guess post-COVID, tensions are very high in both the populations, and it's become much louder. I think if you measure it, the intensity over the last 3-4 months has gone up the most. We actually used machine learning to measure it the last 5 years and just kept seeing rising tensions every time there was a tit-for-tat measure between the US and China. The index went up. And I think post-April, it's made an all-time high, and it continues to go higher in June and July as well.
I argue in here that with China, as opposed to Russia, this is, first of all, this is an incredible competitor, and it's a competitor in the military sphere, in the technology sphere, in finance, in economic.
And we're their best customer.
And they are ours.
Right.
And that's really what makes this different from the old Cold War. There's a reason there's new in new Cold Wars, and there's a reason there's an S at the end. First of all, we're fighting two simultaneously. Okay. The old Cold War, that wasn't the case.
All right, so there we got a pretty good sense that there's this reigning conception that a Cold War has opened up, in geopolitics, but also in the American psyche, that, it's old is new, and that ostensibly Russia is behaving in a way similar to the Soviet Union was, and ostensibly China also takes on the same role. I mean, I'm a little reticent to see it in those terms. I'll put my cards on the table right away, but there's certainly been a number of events that suggest that at the very least there are ramifications in relation to how we are interacting with allies and how we are interacting with former foes or real and existing foes. So what do you think? Is it fair to put new Cold War on the radar?
I mean, there's a lot of caveats here. Okay, I got. By the way, I want to say this in advance. One caveat that's kind of outside of the content. If you see my eyes wander, I have two screens and my notes are on my screen, so that means I will be going to my notes. If you see my eyes wander off the camera. Because that's the caveat. It leads into the.
I think you're assuming that our audience is paying a lot of attention to our video image there.
People pick up on these small little things. You know what I mean?
They do. They do.
Yeah. So I mean,
that's what the comment section is for.
Yeah, we have to really, really be careful. I think we have to be disciplined in our discussion today if we're going to answer this question. Because I'll tell you what I wrote down. When I looked at our plan for today, and I looked at what we sketched out in terms of our guide and our outline, I asked myself this question. I says, can we say the Cold War never ended? Mm-hmm. And here's my answer. I said, it did end. Russia lost and turned into a hyper-capitalist oligarch-run mafia state. Okay? And right now, I mean, there's a convergence. I would argue that might be happening in the United States, but let's leave that aside for now.
Let's leave it aside.
Yeah, the problem with Russia losing and then turning it into a hyper-capitalist state is that the West did not take yes for an answer. Okay? Like they didn't take yes for an answer, that Russia said you won. So through the 1990s into the early 2000s, what we see is this prolonged and sincere attempt by Russians to align itself with the West, and then they just gave up, right? And if this is the one of the many little maxims I hope to catch on with people today. If we take the dollar store, poor man's oracle, the wise man, the doyen of American public thought, Tom Clancy seriously. Okay, the next war is supposed to be between white people against China, and that's the bear and the dragon. If you read that, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is where it gets very tricky.
28 pages of Americans and Russians together killing the Asiatic hordes. I mean, the Chinese here. Okay. And when the U.S. and NATO deployed against Afghanistan, there is multiple directions that we can go here. But off and on, I don't think the Cold War really did end. Precisely that. I think, we're going to take all the critiques right now of what, the American involvement in Ukraine. I mean, that's an example that Cold War never stopped, right? You know, that NATO kept moving and moving and moving. I mean,
I think that's what we got to tease out a little bit, right? Like, how did the United States handle the end of the Cold War? Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, there's only counter movements and movements, you know.
Yeah, this is what you do all the time, Julian. We start this thing, and you're like, we got to stay disciplined, and then you go rushing towards the central theme.
Yeah, but you know why I do that, right? I do that because that was my thesis advisor during my master's, the great Jorge Neff. He always used to stress one: change and continuity, and continuity and change. These are the things you have to tease out, right, all the time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, so let's put the case there, though. Like let's say
that sounds good to me.
You know, let's say in the last 5 years in particular, the competitive tension with China has not just been economic, right? That there is increasing concern about geopolitical moves, and there is a fixation in the American political environment about those geopolitical moves. Now, that's right? Because as John Stewart points out in that clip, right, they are both, they are trading partners on the one hand, but geopolitical rivals on the other. And
by the way, first of all, that mashup was awesome. Job well done, Roddy. But
the video and audio weren't matching there, but I'll work on that.
One of the people that I went to consult on this is one of my favorite guys from the conservative right. He's not a hawk. He's not a mental case. It's Tom Nichols, professor. He's professor emeritus. I can't remember what university, but he writes for the Atlantic regularly, and he's on multiple MSNBC panels, and he's the only guy to me right now who's speaking sense. And I went back and I looked at some of his stuff, and I think that it would be inaccurate to claim that this kind of rivalry between U.S., China, Russia, this kind of triangle between them. I think it's inaccurate to claim that they have reached the crisis proportions that are reminiscent of the Cold War. I think that what we have is a more kind of like a strategic competition. That's what with the new Cold War. But, because the analogy lacks that same kind of ideological conflict, right? And this idea of nuclear brinkmanship on the edge of the Cold War, right? Although, I'm not saying that, that there's brinksmanship with regards to the use of atomic weapons. I mean, I have never heard people speak more openly about limited nuclear warfare.
My question to what you're saying would be is that a function? Is the fact that that's kind of not part of the discussion in the same manner as it was during the Cold War? Is that a function of it not being there as a prevailing threat, or is, and by that I mean not just a threat to the United States, but a threat for humanity? Or is it a function of the fact that it's just receded, the Cold War has receded in our historical memory, so we don't think in those terms anymore, right? We don't think in terms of containment and détente, and the Cuban Missile Crisis and these sorts of things.
Yeah. No, I think you're right.
And so that's sort of left our geopolitical discourse on a common level. I mean, yes, there's so-called security experts who talk about these things all the time, but nonetheless, I think for most people, it's just sort of.
I think the most important thing to do is when we look at global affairs right now, is really just to kind of take inventory and categorize, right?
Yeah.
Fundamentally, the Cold War was a clash between capitalism and communism. Okay.
Okay. So now we're getting to our second theme.
Yeah. Okay. But I'm just trying
just by way of introduction, Julian, I think it's important to say millennials and Zoomers, we cannot assume that this is part of their lived political experience. They may know some of the facts or the timeline, or they have a sense, but they don't really have a sense of what it meant to live in the Cold War and how much it circumscribed almost all geopolitical action and circumscribed domestic politics.
they have no concept of the way life was pre 1989. Like you know what I mean? Like there was a big section of this world that was just closed off to people.
Yeah.
Okay?
So why don't we cover that a little bit? Like, why don't we think about that?
Yeah.
Just because even people who live through it, I think.
Well, you lived through it.
Oh, well, I lived through it, and well, so did you. But
No, but
I mean,
you
I lived
actually
in
lived
it.
there
I went over.
pre-'89.
Yeah, I lived there pre-'89, so I have some kind of really call it tactile lived experience. But but even people who grew up during that era, I think in the last 30 years have really it's left our political memory in many ways, right? And it isn't the lens through which we view either international politics or our own domestic politics. So I think it's worth going where you were just about to go, and that is to say, like, the world was literally divided between these two ideological camps.
And I'm not sure that this idea of communism versus capitalism, I mean, these two monoliths, like if you I would say that
I don't think that captures everything. Yeah.
No, but I think the monolith of capitalism was much more prevalent on the one side than this monolith of what communism was. I mean, you talk to anybody who was born and raised and grew up in Eastern Europe, Poland, East Germany, the Baltic states, the Balkans, Yugoslavia, like the former Yugoslav republics, and communism means different things to them than it does to people here, right? And again, like you said, like it's like I think like if you talk to somebody, sit down and have a real good serious conversation with somebody from Eastern Europe, you just see how quickly jaded they were by this term communism and the romanticism that seems to be attached to it over here, but also this kind of sinister. And they'll just say to you that, hey man, it was just another racket. You know what I mean? For a lot of people, right? Like, and I think that this is really important because the point I'm trying to make is it's not permeable. Now that's a $64 word, right? The point is it's different from place to place to place. Like what was experienced in Romania under Ceausescu is much more different than what was experienced in the Yugoslav republics under Tito or Albania or
or the ostensibly softer, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary, right? And also deeper into Russia.
And I don't think it's a mistake now. I mean, I don't think it's not a mistake, but I don't think it's an anomaly that these were communist states and now they moved all to this authoritarian right-wing fascist. They were the same people.
I think you're very right. I think that the Eastern Bloc has been very much homogenized, and it is not a homogenous place by any stretch of the imagination. And different peoples did experience communism differently. And I think there was simultaneously, you're right, if you speak to someone from Eastern Europe, they have a revulsion both to the romanticism of communism, but also the sinister kind of demonization of communism, because it's insipid and silly.
It's amazing, right? Yeah, exactly. Well put. And precisely.
Yeah, and there is definitely a romanticization that goes on. But I mean, what I would say is that the way in which it did uniformly affect the entire region is, I think that it kind of put a cloud around what it was that was in the West. That is to say, there was this, reciprocal in the same way that maybe the left wing in the West romanticized communism. There was also a dissident romanticization of capitalism and Western lifestyle and Western liberalism, which was very much, in fact, inaccurate, of course, because people did live under completely different political and economic circumstances. Say what you will about communism. It was a different system altogether. And I'll say that with firsthand knowledge, right? People, yes, there was this bureaucratic command system where people, the higher echelons of the party, had all kinds of perks and treats. There's no doubt that there was inequality, but that inequality was much more limited. And really, it was kind of an inequality. I would argue, and maybe there are many out there who disagree with me, but I would argue that it was more of an inequality in kind. So there,
Yes.
there weren't party members
Yeah,
amassing
yeah.
billions of dollars or anything like this. They just had access to some things, a number of things, that standard people didn't have. But across the population, there was definitely an equalization, which many people, chafed under, unquestionably. And that, it was a very small minority of the population that in fact belonged to the party.
I also think we were victims in the West of like extraordinarily inaccurate. I don't know how to phrase this, because I was going to say inaccurate propaganda. Is there anything else but other inaccurate propaganda? But the propaganda was that the Russians were like these like 25-foot soldiers who shit bullets and technologically astute and what we found out, that this was a massive misstep and a kind of like an overly ambitious and terribly unfocused view of what the East was, or Eastern Europe was, right? And then all of a sudden, in the 1980s, you had Chernobyl, and then we found out that, holy Jesus, like this is like a rotting and rusting hull of a ship. The society is like they barely hanging on, and then in a short 6 to 7 years later, I'm talking from the span from about 1985, right, which is kind of like the middle of perestroika, right? Which I'm using terms now.
That's actually by 85, Gorbachev is just coming into power, right?
Okay, yeah, okay. So it's the beginning of perestroika, glasnost, right?
Yeah. Yes, yeah.
And then like it starts there. And then by 1985, 86, 1991, like they're falling. Like, what took 10 years in Poland to do takes 10 days in Romania. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And all the republics just fall like dominoes, boom, 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 because in many ways the whole system was just basically a paper tiger.
Yeah, I think that there was definitely a brewing dissatisfaction. But again, there we have a tendency to homogenize. I think we homogenize across the East the degree of dissatisfaction and what people wanted to do with that dissatisfaction. Right. So there was a desire for freedom. No question, there was a desire for political rights and political freedom. And that's why you have this string of, sometimes violent, often not violent revolutions in the street from East Germany, through all of the Central East European countries, and then eventually, into the core Soviet space. But what people wanted to do in the aftermath of that, I think, is kind of an open question. And
like for me,
there are these surveys that were taken, I know, in the Soviet Union through the perestroika glasnost period, and right up until the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and a referendum, in fact, was launched where Soviet citizens voted in favor of keeping the republic together. So it's not altogether clear that it had to take the path that it did.
One of the things that I lament about is that we don't have that, one of the things that came out of political science in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s through that, CIA-sponsored National Defense Education Act was that they created area studies, right? And all of those
and international relations as well.
Yeah, which spawns out of that, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And what they did was, these were incredible, at a certain level in terms of information gathering. Okay, remember we used to use that. One of the first things when the interweb became big, one of the first things that you can go to was what they called the CIA fact book. And each country had these lists of like unbelievable things. I think that's kind of, in the Cold War, with the chaos of information and all the kinds of like, moving around of like non-state actors and so much things, all of that kind of like went by the wayside. People didn't do area studies anymore, right? Mm-hmm. And what I did was I kind of like, this idea of like, what, this question, let me just get my original stuff up here. When you said, have the relations between the U.S. and its rival powers reached crisis proportion that are reminiscent of the Cold War? And I kind of broke it down into 6 categories, right? And I broke it down into this kind of idea of like the way that the key differences between current tensions and the old Cold War. There was the ideological conflict, which we've kind of talked about with regards to capitalism and communism. I titled this one, I called it Nuclear Brinksmanship. What's going on here? Okay. Which basically, the Cuban Missile Crisis, all of these kind of wars through proxies, you know what I mean? Proxy wars, which the biggest ones on our side were the civil wars that took place in El Salvador. And El Salvador, its current state is directly related to the old Cold War. I mean, you've got this son of a bitch in power over there, who's basically another client. It's a client state because of the chaos that it was created during the civil wars of these kind of tensions between
during the El Duarte regime. Yeah.
And then I looked at this idea of what they called, the global system of alliances, the idea of NATO, the Warsaw Pact, how that kind of went through this kind of it was rigid and then it wasn't rigid anymore or defined. The movement of this almost economic integration on steroids. I mean, that's when we have one of the great movements of great accelerations in globalization with the end of the, and that also had, you had the Soviet blocs, the Chinese sphere of influence, and then the moving WTO, which was basically the American Empire. And now I saw the old strategic competition between the rival powers over various areas, military, economic, technological, and then that's kind of shifted and changed. The geopolitical rivalries, it's kind of, and then the last one I put was the arms race. Okay? And what I concluded was that the U.S. and its rival powers are engaged in a period of intense competition again. And it's an exaggeration to say that, I mean, is it an exaggeration? Sorry. To say that the relations have reached crisis proportions, particularly with what's going on in Ukraine, and
you mean in terms of being characterized as a Cold War?
Yeah, and also what is taking place now as of this weekend in Pakistan and India. Okay.
Yeah.
No, I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that's missing. I think that one thing that's missing in this geopolitical competitive environment that you're talking about is, you sort of summarize it by the idea of ideological camps, but I think it's more than that, right? It's more than adherence to an ideology. It is actually the organizational principles that make up these societies. And in the Cold War period, you have the offering up of explicitly an alternative way, an alternative vision for society. And maybe that's the way to put it, right? That each of these camps had different visions for society. Whether, we can get into all kinds of debates about, whether East European populations actually bought into the vision or they didn't buy into the vision. But that is how the system was ultimately organized. And the existence of that kind of mutual threat discourse is, in one part, of course, in a very large part, it's military on the one hand, but it's also the threat that a contending political, economic, social system will succeed where the other does not, right? That it will show up the other. And so there is this, constant desire to show, not that just that we're better economically, but that we have a more successful vision for society. Right? We have the right vision for society going forward, the right vision for humanity going forward.
I'd like to insert here, okay? And I mean this with all my heart. And I'm not still romanticizing the Soviet Union or the former Soviet republics, and at the same time, what was going on in the capitalist free world. As far as I'm concerned, okay, that post-war period, 45 onwards, okay, to the present, for both sides of this Cold War, were human catastrophes. Okay?
Yeah. And for millions of people around the world as well.
Precisely. I'm not going to say, one of the things, Slavoj Žižek, is constantly finding himself in this position where he has got to kind of admonish the old romanticism regarding the USSR. And, he always says it's unequivocally a human catastrophe. But hey, come on this side of the freaking of that divide and tell me that the same ones. And I mean, Latin America in the 1980s, and another fucking categorization. What the fuck is Latin America, right? Like, I mean, South America, Central America, the Caribbean, these are very, very diverse regions. But let's just take that part as a hemispheric whole for as matter. That was the 1980s and the 1990s were two lost decades for those continents.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Lost decades. So, for those who want to kind of throw mud at the Soviet Union as being a catastrophe, the capitalism was just as bad. I mean, we're not even going to talk about what happened on the continent of Africa throughout the 80s and the 90s, and it's still lingering to this day. Okay? And so, like, I mean, the one thing I do want to bring up, though, is one of the things I think that confuses people when we talk about this idea if there's a new Cold War, and this is my wheelhouse, I'd like to say I'm proud of, is that whole transition to democracy theory, okay? Or transitions to democracy that took place in the late 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, where you saw many Eastern European nations try to transition to democratic systems and get integrated into the European Union and NATO and so on and so forth. And I don't know how, because this is such a vast conversation, but that has to be factored into the conversation and how that skews the way we see this new Cold War, right? We think that,
I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, like one day we think
look, you hinted at it. Right? You hinted at it at the very beginning. Beginning because you said Russia lost. This idea, like, right? You said Russia lost, and that's just a throwaway term, of course, right? Like, it's kind of shorthand for the way we talk about the Cold War, but in many ways it summarizes the way I think that the West took the disillusion of the communist state apparatuses, right? That the West had won. The West had won.
Yeah.
And that nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, the disillusion of these systems was way more complex from that, and much of it was internal.
As an undergrad and a master's student, I used to fucking hate these fucking morons who used to, like, carry this.
Oh, there it is. See, I pushed Julian's button. I mean,
you know what it is, right? I'll come back to this in a second. This is what is it Scaramucci called my Italian exoskeleton, right? You know what
Italian
I mean?
Exoskeleton. Yeah. I heard that too. I found that very amusing. Yeah.
This fucking bullshit. Like, I used to, and all these, like, these sympathizers with conservative and Reagan and Thatcher, like, did that one day, they woke up in Warsaw and Prague and Budapest, and they were part of the old the Soviet Union, and then the next day they were a democracy, and everything was fine.
Yeah.
Like, what an ignorant freaking view of the world. Okay. Yeah. And that still carries on today. Those people are fucked, man. Like, if you've traveled in this world and you go to Eastern Europe now, I mean, come on, please. You've been there. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah. And I'll say this. I mean, from my personal experience, I mean, I spent 2 years in communist Czechoslovakia prior to the fall of the wall. And, like, I have no doubt that many of the things people are saying about those systems, they ring true. They very much ring true with large parts of the citizenry. Like I said earlier, people were looking for political rights. There was no question. And they did chafe under a lack of the state apparatus and the security apparatus that these countries had. But to say that is one thing, but to say that nothing was lost in the transition and that it was just all, milk and honey and, open arms to capitalism, that, the transition was seamless, and the evidence points to in exactly the opposite direction with some qualifications. But, that simply wasn't the case. I mean, these transitions were extraordinary in the pain that they inflicted on populations, and in such a telescoped fashion, right? We can think of lots of examples around the world in which, populations have to experience extraordinary circumstances. But here we have an entire region of the world, from country to country to country, that had this intensified process, right, of political, economic, and social change overnight, like really, like dropped in their lap.
Yeah, you can ignore, like, you can ignore so much, right? Like, I mean, like 56, 55 in Hungary, right? What was that if that was not like you know, a kind of liberalization, or a movement to liberalize what was the
Absolutely.
old communist state? It was met with, and then again in '68 in Prague. I have a dear friend who's from Poland, and she can tell you stories about what the culture was during the '80s and the '90s and the '70s. Like, these guys were, like, they were breaking new paths in music, in the jazz genre, for crying out loud. Like, you know, we
Yeah,
make it sound
absolutely.
like as if they were like living in like the dark ages. Nothing could be further from the truth, man. You know what I mean? I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
I think that's right. But yeah, yeah, I think that's
they were
absolutely right.
definitely
And
they were definitely living under totalitarian conditions and restrictive conditions. But to think that it was like, you know, it's like, you know, it's like that Family Guy episode when Stewie and what's the dog, Brian, go to the North Pole to see you know, find Santa Claus, right? And they get there, and it's like this dark and dreary factory, like, you know, where everybody's like a zombie and already half dead, and
yeah,
they're working to death in factories. No, man, not at all. I mean, talk to anybody from the former Yugoslav republics, Croatia, Serbia. This was like this was a society that matched the West in terms of like material standards of living, and you could leave the country from time to time and move a little bit more. It's a like
yeah. And on
like
top of
there's
that,
certain,
on top of that, though, Julian, you know, that's looking at the whole society. But there was always an undercurrent of incredible civil society, right? And indeed, to
and
this day,
also
to
yeah,
this
and
day,
we
you
should
know,
say
they do a
we
lot
should also
of,
say
you
like
know, yeah. Go ahead.
serious repression. Okay, serious repression, like the Stasi in East Germany, Czechoslovakia from '68 onwards, Romania. Like, these were not like you know who opened me up to this was when I started to read the works of Milan Kundera, my favorite novelist, the Czech writer. Okay. And, you know, everybody loves The Unbearable Lightness of Being because of this, like, you know, kind of like this Freudian, you know, sexual relations between men and women and this philandering. But that was so secondary to me when I read that. When I read that, I couldn't believe the way that he was talking about Eastern European society, okay,
Hmm.
and the kind of conventions that existed, particularly
Hmm.
under the kind of like the totalitarian communist regimes. And I was going, my God, he could be writing about here. You know what I mean? The
Yeah, no,
parallels of
that's right.
conformity.
Yeah, yeah, and the
Yeah.
deep connections and set of subterranean rules that existed between people, and between trusting individuals, right? And they do
Perfect,
polls
Roddy.
now.
Perfect. Yeah.
They do polls now, actually, public opinion surveys now, and it's very widespread across the region that people think that one of the big differences between the previous era and now is that in the previous era, despite the presence of that security apparatus, you could trust people and you knew who you could trust. You always knew. And now, in their current circumstances, in post-transition societies, there's no social trust, or not no
No,
social trust, but there's a
absolutely.
greatly diminished social trust, right? Because
Yeah,
it's
no,
become increasingly individualized.
I think you just nailed it. I mean, and I mean, like, we've got some lovely questions here. I mean, I don't know, am I jumping the gun, but I'm going to introduce it anyway because you have this
Yeah.
in our outline. One of the things you raise here is like how this political situation was handled both in the East and the West, and are the mistakes made during the post-Cold War transition period at the root of our contemporary problems?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think it's
Yeah.
really important to sort that out. Like, because we have this
Well,
image
this is
of,
critical.
yeah, I think we still, to this day, and particularly, this podcast is primarily about American politics. And so, like, seen through that lens, I think that there's to this day, there's very much a preconception that everyone in the Eastern Bloc just, absolutely stampeded towards liberal, democratic, capitalist social organization, that they just could not wait to become capitalists. They could not wait to become liberal Democrats. I'm getting excited. Liberal Democrats in the Western sense. And again, this has to be complicated. on a certain level, that certainly was there. But, if you start to look back at, the first of all, the policy program of someone like Gorbachev and what Gorbachev was trying to do inside the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, it was to reform the system, and it was even to allow in liberal democratic and capitalist elements. But there was no desire necessarily to stampede towards the system. Or you look at Václav Havel, the eventual first political prisoner and eventual leader of Czechoslovakia, and then later the Czech Republic.
And you can go earlier to
Lech Walesa.
Lech Walesa.
Yeah. Lech Walesa. All of these people were advocating, yes, for a movement towards more Western values, but it was more along the lines of social democracy than it was this full gauge.
A liberalization of the regime that they were living under.
Absolutely.
Not a movement to the Statue of Liberty like everybody, they want to be free like us.
Yeah.
No, they wanted
and
to
that
still
was
have the trappings of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was, I think, the preconception of the West. And when we talk about how it was handled, it's, the flip side of that is that, you had George Bush Sr. then proclaiming the West's victory, right? That, the Soviet Union didn't fall. Yeah, exactly. The Soviet Union didn't fall. It was pushed, right?
This is something that really bothers me, okay? This idea that Fukuyama was the first guy to come up with this end of history. Like, this was a discussion in the 1960s at the very beginning of the hard Cold War, okay? Where people in the United States were talking about the end of ideology. Like, this is not something new that Fukuyama came up with, I think
I guess he was the right guy at the right time. That's not.
Yeah, I know. Like, which we knew a lot of those guys at York, okay? What I found really interesting about that whole period, it was that the real specter was Huntington, and he fucking kind of like they manufactured these things when Huntington was saying, no, it's not the end of ideology. We're moving into a clash of civilizations. Now, I'm not sure how that factors into here, but there's a lot of overlapping and kind of because I think what people really need to look at, the kind of cradle underneath all of this discussion, is that this was an opportunity to accelerate globalization. And what I mean by accelerate globalization, I don't mean just accelerate like soft power. Remember Joseph Nye with that pedestrian Gramscian view, which actually makes a little bit of sense. I've always found that bizarre because, when you talked about hegemony to conservatives, there was, you're into conspiracy theory? And then they would say, no, we have soft power. This kind of doublespeak, but nonetheless, it was a period and an opportunity to accelerate globalization, not just in terms of the circuits of capital, but also in terms of the cultural wave of capitalism. You know what I mean? Consumerism, right? And like you talked about this idea, like a lot of people don't understand that a lot of the struggles that took place in former Eastern European republics was to preserve a social democratic state. And they just got
I think that's right. But I think that's right. And it's interesting, the two authors you raised. Again, we don't want to get too. We're trying really hard not to go down the academic, into the academic maelstrom here on this podcast. So, but the two authors you mentioned, Fukuyama, which I think many people are familiar with, and maybe Huntington people a little bit less. Those two images kind of fit lockstep with American foreign policy in the period, right? On the one hand, you have the idea of the end of history, that there is now no alternative system. Remember, we talked about this alternative vision. There is no alternative vision for society. And so, America needs to march forward as the leader in the global environment. So I think you're right. This is a moment to spread globalization, but not without determined and forceful American leadership, right? It has to be America at the forefront in this time period. And then the clash of civilization. The clash of civilization, that fits in because I think that many in the foreign policy establishment in the United States realized very quickly that you're not going to have this determined American leadership if you don't have consummate threat around which you can rally the population and which you can rally geopolitical allies. And so, Huntington kicks off in many ways this entire security debate through the 90s of trying to organize new threats. What's the new primary threat to the United States? And in relation to how Eastern Europe got handled there, it was this assumption that, look, we're going to figure out what the primary threat is. We're going to protect now, the sole vision, which is liberal democratic capitalism, the only way in which humanity can move forward. And the assumption is that Eastern Europe is just going to come along for the ride. And
Bingo.
And
I'm looking at your notes.
Yeah.
I'm looking at your notes because Rodney and I exchange notes. Well, he actually sends me more notes than I send him. I'm better at talking than writing, although I do a lot of writing. Rodney, I was looking at your notes, and you kind of say this. You say like the kind of like victory is not what it seems, right? If there's a need for a new enemy, there around which a new national identity, and you also have these undercurrents that are starting to bubble to the top, right? Like the increasing dissatisfaction with democracy and the rise of right-wing nationalism that is also occurring in the United States and now finds it's coalescing within the Republican Party now. You have the consolidation and the enhancement of NATO, the integration.
But first, of course, a questioning of NATO, right? Importantly, early 90s period, there's an immediate questioning of NATO. What's the point of NATO? Why do we have NATO anymore?
And you got me. You beat me to the punch because you talk about this idea of the not pursuing of the peace dividend, right? And you were talking about like what was very common in the 90s, if you were a political science student as an undergrad, or even in the mainstream media, if you were paying attention, was this discussion of the peace dividend and human security. Let's attack the issues of sustainable development so that we can deal with climate change, so that we can distribute food equally and better, stop starvation, the AIDS crisis. And it was all of this stuff. And nobody paid attention. And like that whole human security discourse just seemed to get steamrolled by, because it just, forget it, like capitalism, trade agreements. That's the only way to deal with this is trickle down economics across the globe. And fuck you all if you're not on board. Okay.
Absolutely. And the symbol of that was the degree or the way in which, the Bush administration and then the Clinton administration signaled that Yeltsin, for instance, was their man, right? That Yeltsin
this blows me away.
Yeah.
This always
and
blows
Yeltsin
me away,
then
Rodney.
became the repository of precisely that end of history, right? Where it is just foretold that Russia, and all of the East European states need to conform to the Washington Consensus. They need to impose markets, not just, in the long run, but in a shock therapy form of way, right? Transition has to happen with this so-called J curve, right? Like a hard shock to the system. And then, the hope is that the graph will go up. And indeed, in some countries, it does, like in the Visegrad countries, in Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary. That effect to some degree is there, although even that can be qualified. But there is an array of other countries in which this doesn't happen. And one of the, major ones is Ukraine.
Well, this is what I was going to say. We're bypassing so much. And I know for a lot of you freaking, snobs out there, they're forgetting this and they're forgetting. Well, fuck you, first of all. Okay. But secondly, Secondly, fuck, we only have fucking goddamn 45 to 55 minutes. So we're trying to get everything in and we're making these broad sweeping things. So again, fuck you if you think that we know we're bypassing this stuff. But in that J curve that you're talking about, right? And this idea of Yeltsin, Yeltsin to me reminds me of some of the local drunks at my favorite pub when I lived in,
well, I think that's what he reminded Russians of as well.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And what does it come out of?
By the way, I spent a good deal of time in Russia during the Yeltsin years.
I know.
And I will tell you, the rumors are all true. The rumor, it was the wild west.
That was gangster capitalism. I was like, that was the Wild West back then, man. And I mean,
it really was.
And what do you get? You get. It's interesting. You get Putin out of this, and Putin in the early stages is on board. Like, he's gonna discipline the Russians to get on with the discussions of the West, and then later he just kind of makes that U-turn and says, "Yeah, I don't think we're gonna do this thing with you guys anymore."
No, that's right. And then he turns to admonish the West.
Yeah, like the question with Ukraine, like, almost is immediately on the map after the collapse of this USSR. Because I mean, what's the first thing that Ukraine basically does is give up their nuclear weapons, right? Because everybody is
under extraordinary pressure. Yeah,
under
because pressure from the United States.
I mean, everybody understood that they couldn't maintain that infrastructure, okay, which was to keep all these nuclear weapons like in check. There was rumors that they didn't even know what the inventory was for periods, and they were worried that a lot of people would have those quote unquote dirty bombs out of that. And and then they also gave it up because they figured, the Russians are not going to invade us. You know what I mean? And
also I think that I also think though that there was an assumption, and it was an assumption propagated by the U.S. foreign policy establishment, that these regions were going to come either symbolically or literally under the security umbrella of the United States and the NATO allies. And Ukraine is an incredible example of that. And also, alongside of that, of course, lots of promises about economic development. Should, if the Ukraine wants to move forward, they're going to have to make geopolitical sacrifices. And with that, of course, then they have the opportunity to join the larger liberal capitalist, trading network. Of course, that never came true for Ukraine. In fact, to this day, Ukraine has never recovered the economic level it had pre-1991. So, that's an extraordinary thing when you think about it. In 30 years,
and I think, right, what you just said, that's the seeds of the conflict, right?
Yeah.
That's why you have this mishmash of contradictions, right? Where, and I really have very little patience for people who think that it's this kind of binary notion that, the Americans, pushed the Ukrainians into this. Yeah, I mean, there's a huge element of that. That in many ways, the Ukrainians are basically victims of American onslaught of their empire, and you know what I mean. But at the same time,
and also a Russian onslaught, right? Like, let's not kid ourselves. The Russians have never not been involved in Ukraine.
Yeah, I was just about to say the same thing. Like, if you think that they were going to give that up that easy, you're living in the dreamland. You know what I mean? Yeah. I mean, just look at what they've done to cities like Mariupol. Okay, that they don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
So I mean, I know. Listen,
but I mean, part of that claim. I mean, we're jumping around a little bit, but I mean, I think that one really important thing that we can draw from that is that, while we have in this time, like through the, let's say from, the East European revolutions through to say 2010, through to the Obama period, while we have some, and I'll put that in quotation marks, success stories like the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary, there are a slew of other countries, core ex-Soviet states, but also Bulgaria, Romania, many of the former Yugoslavian states, with the exception, the Republic of Georgia, with the, and Bosnia Herzegovina has done fairly well because they got a lot of international aid. But other than that, they have
to sacrifice almost like 15% of their population for it.
Yeah, there is, at the very best, like the best picture we could paint is that it's a mixed bag. But the more realistic picture is that, this has been a social, human, an economic catastrophe for these regions. Many of those countries have not recovered their GDP since, to the pre-revolution period. They may never recover. They've experienced a massive demographic crisis. That is to say, there's been an outflow of people. There's a massive mortality crisis, increased rates of suicide, mortality rates that are much higher in Russia. I mean, life expectancy in Russia is now for males is in the 50s. Why? Alcohol consumption, massive alcohol consumption.
Yeah.
There's been a fertility crisis. It goes on and on. So,
I want to insert something here, okay? Because when we have these discussions and we talk about these crises that are in the social sphere that are taking place in a continent, be careful if you think that that's what goes on over there. Look around you here, okay? Those same kind of social collapses are happening here, okay? And for the same reasons. For the same reason.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and I guess I raised that because the egging on of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, and it must be said other Western powers as well, there's this assumption that lives in the East are they may be hard, but they're getting better. They're always getting better. And that is simply not the case in many of these regions. And so if we want to explain, and this is where I was trying to go with this, the increasing dissatisfaction within these countries and the turn towards more authoritarian regimes, not entirely authoritarian, but more authoritarian regimes, or to right-wing regimes. And we see this in the Ukraine, this movement between Western and Russian sympathetic regimes, right? That have, both sides often have this kind of right-wing authoritarian tenor to them. We shouldn't be surprised by that. With those concrete conditions, how else could it have ever been?
Well, I guess, let me just take a few moments here to kind of add something, because, we're trying to fast forward to the current crisis in Ukraine and these kind of Democratic and Republican reactions to it. But here's something that's really important to consider. What you just talked about in terms of like these social collapses, right? Where society's collapsing at the level, like things like rampant alcoholism, homelessness, just all sorts of social disasters. This has precipitated a migrant crisis, right? Like a lot of the problem, particularly in Western Europe and particularly in Great Britain, they're Eastern European economic migrants trying to leave this. And then these societies that are leaving, they're also being overly taxed by another biblical, and let me say that again, biblical migrant crisis that is coming from the global South. And a lot of these people who are fleeing wars that have been started in the West are ending up in states like Slovenia, Croatia, Romania, Hungary, that are basically Middle Eastern and African. And those societies have already been obliterated by the whole thing. And this feeds totally into that rise of the right, because they're not going to deal with these migrations with democratic policies. They're just going to say, look, we have to do something here because we're overloaded. And the easy answer is to bring in a strong man who promises revenge and moral renewal. Okay?
Yeah.
And we're not immune to that either.
Yeah, and I think that, that might explain a little less the policies of Russia, but it definitely explains policies like those in Hungary and, Orban and people like that. Yeah. And I mean, but I think, but it says something about, the sort of inherent connection that seems emergent in the last 5 years, or 10 years between, the Republican Party and many of these right-wing movements in Eastern Europe, which it has to be said, they were already making connections before Trump came along. I mean, this is not all Trump.
And it was very much on the after effects of the collapse of the Cold War, or the changing nature of it, whatever you want, change in continuity, right? For example, look at the groups like that the Republicans and the Democrats supported initially in is it the Maidan movement? This was a coalition I have never seen in anything in my life, where you had liberal Democrats teaming up with Nazis, okay?
Yeah.
To bring down and that's actually the nature of the rebel Ukrainian forces right now. Is like you have these Nazi soldiers, or Nazi paramilitary groups teaming up with liberal Democrats to fight off the invasion of the Russians, which is I'll be honest with you. I remember when couple of years ago when the war was about to take place, and you and I were talking, and I was like really worried. And you basically said, never underestimate this kind of over-evaluation of Russian strength, right? And boy, oh boy, did that ever come true.
Yeah, and that's that's what I kind of want to get to a little bit with it's what makes the Ukrainian situation so prescient in terms of this idea of the new Cold War, because what you see, of course, are the parties kind of immediately breaking down their position in relation to how they see Russia. And quite interestingly, I think the Democrats are the ones that are, in fact, the Cold Warriors now. It's the Democrats who actually want to project in relation to Russia the most stark divisions, right? And in doing so, and that's, I think, what leads me, this is where I'm connecting to what you said. It leads to this over-evaluation of what Russia is. Right? Putin then becomes the repository of all evil. And there is the assumption that the great Russian bear is going to, is going to show its teeth again.
Yeah,
and what Biden, it displays. Biden bought into this.
Biden's this old Cold War warrior. Like,
absolutely.
We're gonna bring the Russians down. We
absolutely,
won, and we're gonna do it again. It's unreal.
But I think that is the homogenization of the East, right? There's this assumption that there's no layering in society, that there are no inefficiencies in society, that there are no deep contradictions inside Russian society, whether it's communist or it's not. And so, seeing Russia through the eyes of the Cold War, then, you just see this geopolitical monster, but you don't actually see the complications of that society. And you mentioned it at the very beginning, that these societies had very deep problems from the 1960s forward. And there were massive inefficiencies. And I can speak to that, in a firsthand way, right? I mean, I witnessed that, the way in which the public spaces, the industrial spaces were allowed to erode precisely because they were public. And it was a classic problem in East European. I mean, I say that as a very left-wing person. A classic problem in a socialized system is, how do you get individuals to care for the public space, right? When they may or may not want to. Right. And this was the difficulty. And once that erosion kicked in within that system, it was extremely difficult, to reverse without, Stalinistic terror.
What it comes down to is kind of what we're experiencing here now in the West. All those former Soviet republics, their government structures, just like the legitimacy collapsed. They lost legitimacy. Yeah. Nobody believed in them anymore. You know what I mean? Like, that whole basis that was based on tenuous norms and conventions, where people like just would show up at a stop sign. Like, ask yourself, why do you stop at a stop sign when you're in the middle of the country? Right?
Yeah,
you know what I mean? And there's nobody. Yeah,
because inherently you recognize the legitimacy of that stop sign, right? Like,
and what happened is, like, in Eastern Europe, it just, like, overnight, it just said, because Solzhenitsyn's got that incredible quote. He goes, "They're lying to us. We know they're lying to us. They know that we know that they're lying to us." And it goes on, right? That quote. And
I used to say, I used to say that. I had friends in Czechoslovakia who would joke about that. It's like, I lie to you and you lie to me and we're all happy. Like,
yeah, exactly. And it's getting to that point, right? And it's interesting because I'm looking at the notes. You have this incredible note here. I actually highlighted it. And, it's how the Democrats are so devoted to this kind of institutional rigidity in their geopolitics, which is this hangover of the Cold War, that they give in to the Republican talking points, because they don't offer an alternative, right? So, like, they're always kind of defending the status quo, which is the old kind of Cold War position, right?
Yeah.
Because they're so afraid of.
That's right.
Yeah.
Which is deeply problematic. I mean, it's deeply problematic, not because, I'm not of the opinion that the Americans shouldn't have given aid to Ukraine. I am simply not of that opinion. Like, there was,
Same here. Same here.
I mean, that was a situation that had to be addressed. There's no question about that.
Let's be blunt about it. If the Americans weren't going to give it to them, they were going to get it from somewhere else, and probably somewhere far more sinister than. I mean, they probably are getting that kind of help on aid already, but in combination with American aid. Okay.
Yeah.
Like,
I think that's right.
Yeah, like, I mean, look no further than, I mean, this reminds me, like, of like some of the.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, this reminds me of some of, like, the kind of doublespeak that goes on, and I don't mean to introduce something that's completely foreign here, but when you used to talk to people about who was arming the PLO the rebel groups in Gaza and in Palestine, right? They were Israeli colonels. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's right.
They were selling weapons.
That's an established fact. That's an established fact.
Yeah. So I mean, like, you have the same kind of they were the guys who were arming Hamas so that they could stay in business, and you can see this kind of this thing taking place. I mean, hey man.
Yeah, and I think that I think that it goes back to that idea that the American security establishment and ultimately the American political establishment can't fathom the idea of American leadership without an existential threat hanging over them. They need that existential threat. And the Democrats in many ways play into the Republicans' hand that way. I mean, the Republicans have kind of shifted the targets, but that same notion of an existential threat still lives in the Republican Party, and it's shifting from Russia to China.
And that is the heart of their political capital.
Yeah,
okay, it's
absolutely. And and that's where the geopolitical blends into the domestic, right? You need that fear. That's a good spot for me to. That's a good spot for me to play this clip.
Yeah, but that's what I was setting you up for. But before you do, I want to use the example of what I want to kind of concretize or give a clearer example of what I'm talking about. Cuba. Cuba is the perfect example. Like, if the Americans wanted, and we're talking as far back as 1980, if the Americans wanted to liberate Cuba, it wouldn't take more than a couple of weeks. Okay. If they would be tin soldiers. Okay, they would just take it over. Right, especially after 1980, 81, 82, when the Russians couldn't even afford to kind of bankroll them anymore.
Yeah, or the lean years in the 90s.
Yeah, but why don't they?
Yeah, because they need it. Because they need it.
Yeah, traditionally, why traditionally have they not? Well, because Cuba's good political capital. What is Florida? Yep. Florida's always been a swing state. How do Republicans win the state when they need it? They point to the ugly monster that was Fidel Castro and everybody and the Cubans and you're going to be soft on Cuba? You're soft on Cuba? That guy, we can't elect him because he's soft on Cuba and Cuban refugees. So it's good to keep Cuba alive because it's political capital. And the master of this is that fucking little vampire, which you're going to play a clip of right now.
Yeah, Stephen Miller. I'll play that right now.
This administration is also fighting to get critical race theory out of our school districts. Children will be taught to love America. Children will be taught to be patriots. Children will be taught civic values for schools that want federal taxpayer funding. So as we close the Department of Education and we provide funding to states, we are going to make sure that these funds are not being used to promote communist ideology. For any nation to be successful, it cannot teach its children to hate themselves and to hate their country. So these are a few of the areas in which President Trump has fought the cancerous communist woke culture.
I mean, I know it enrages the mind.
What the fuck? Like, I don't know what the fuck to say. You know, man, like the right wing produces these guys like the way GM used to produce fucking cars. Like, I have this meme that I save about Pierre Poilievre, okay? And it's one of his former staffers basically quotes, Poilievre's demeanor is so petulant and so repellent as to cross the line into anti-charisma. His unlikability is so reliable as to actually constitute a talent of its own if one could monetize irritation. And now that would be an understatement to describe Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller is a reptile. End of story.
Yeah, I fundamentally agree. And yet they're able, and this is where it really links up with what we're talking about, right? They are able in many ways to turn the table on Democrats who fixate on this Cold War notion and a new Cold War, and they are stuck in these rigidities. But Republicans can draw off those rigidities and then make this connection to domestic politics and harness this fear of communism, this fear of a geopolitical threat that also exists within, right? It also exists inside of the United States. It is truly the new McCarthyism.
Well, yeah, but it's easy to just go down that road to McCarthyism because this is the crisis of liberalism, particularly what we would call maybe left liberalism. Okay, I don't even want to call it, but just they're liberals. Okay, because they're constantly in a position of defending the status quo. Okay, because they're afraid that if they don't defend the status quo, then lunatics like Stephen Miller. And in the process, they don't offer real, tangible alternatives, particularly progressive ones, because they put themselves in a straitjacket. And when you're constantly defending the status quo, it becomes easy for an animal, okay, a reptilian mental case like Stephen Miller to rise through the ranks. Precisely
but what's
because
weird,
you can monetize and capitalize on it.
I agree with all of that, but it's just so weird that in a previous era, we'll call it previous era, 10 years ago, the Democrats were running in fear that they weren't institutional enough, right? That the Republicans were accusing them of being soft on national security. And so they were trying to, intensify their national security credentials. And now it's the case that the Republicans have run away from that, and now they're defending those same credentials, right? So it's just no matter maybe it speaks to the inability of the Democrats to innovate in any particular policy or social philosophy. Yeah,
they haven't developed. This is why we used to talk about this up at the Ann Stretch Wing and at you and I particularly. This is why they hated Clinton, right? Because the Clintons in particular, could triangulate those issues. They knew how to pivot politically, which was to basically steal their agenda, right? This is why they hate
that's right.
so much, and because, but that's the problem too. I think that when you don't have anything other than just empty slogans and rather than a plan. And the plan is and this is that old brokerage style politics that North America is famous for is, no, hire me, vote for me because I can do the job better than you can. Not that we don't disagree. So then you leave that space open for this kind of radical bullshit, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And don't kid yourself, friends. The people on the left, we have the same types. Those are the guys who wear the flannel shirts and they look like George Orwell in 1936. Homage to Catalonia with the flannel shirt and the machine gun that doesn't work. Still living out some fucking fantasy from the fucking 1930s.
This is why I love doing podcasts with you, Julian, because I can always count, no matter what the topic area is, I can always count on your awesome imagery to liven things up. No matter how boring it gets on this end, I know you're going to put some flair into what we're talking about, and that's very important. I think that's a good.
So listen, again, I'm not a big fan of Anthony Scaramucci, but I listened to him on the podcast with John Heilman, and I really made a connection with the guy when he said, people don't take me serious. I'm a well-read guy. It's just this Italian exoskeleton, and because like Scaramucci, I'm a knuckle dragger. I came from that area. I know how to fucking fight and swear. So, and I'm not giving up on that shit.
Why should you? Why should you?
No, thank you. But I want to say something. This really bugs me because, when it comes to, our last question in our notes is are these being viewed through the lens of the new Cold War? Of course they are. But where are we going with this, right? What is coming out of this? Okay, and I think we're right. I think that the global, like what's happening now in the United States domestic political scene is totally going to determine the next 25 years. I mean, this is like people are talking about this self-inflicted wound, okay? Like the door has been opened, okay, wide, not for the Russians to walk through, okay, but for the Chinese, the Iranians, and India, okay?
Yep.
And we want like starting now, get used to this. This ain't going to be a unipolar world anymore. Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that. I
agree
fundamentally agree with that.
Like look how quickly Australia has become an important international player now in defense. Okay. I mean, like
let me just say, we're gonna do a podcast on the economy in a week's time or so, right? And I think that's the flip side of this, right? That's the converse of this. Right? Because what all this new and maybe that's a good spot to kind of bring it all together. Like what all this new Cold War discourse does, I think, in many ways, and the way it's been put on steroids in the last, say since 2022, I think that it offers a real smokescreen for, the American administration to go in, wild directions, right? It offers a smokescreen for Trump to pull off a number of different things while he claims the China threat, while he claims the, imbroglio, in Europe is a function of Biden. He can just sort of push these things off, and then we don't pay attention to what's actually happening, in the undercurrents in American society. Not that nobody's paying attention. Clearly people are paying attention, but it's not really receiving the same kind of coverage because, this notion that China has to be dealt with still it has incredible currency and circulation in the United States. And part of that is, I think, this Cold War discourse that's doing that, which is ill-fitting, especially in the Chinese case, I think.
Well, I mean, this notion, like, I mean, if you're monitoring a couple things, I'd like to throw in a few things in the mix that I made my notes here. Okay, a couple things.
Okay, but you got to do it fast because we are.
Yeah, I really want to do it fast. I've noticed. Okay, then I'll leave it at one. I had three of them, and the other two I can bring in next week.
Of course you did. Of course you did.
Yeah, I know, but they're important, like, because they kind of bridge. Like next week, folks, I think we're going to have an extraordinary one for you. I just want to kind of talk about just that for 2 minutes. Essentially, what we're calling next week is the political economy of it all. Okay, the chaos of the global markets, the internal markets. So we'll just put that aside. But there was another thing I want to talk about was, first of all, this idea that like. The Chinese regime is not taking Trump's calls, or they're not eager in calling him at all. As a matter of fact, neither is Putin. Okay, but okay, I want to throw this in here. It's a bit of since we've been like all over the place, like gangbusters, and we're bypassing stuff. One of the things that I've noticed that is starting to take a lot of currency. When I spoke about that Scaramucci podcast with John Howman, he brought it up. But I also saw Stuart Stevens bring this up in his podcast on the Lincoln Square podcast. Okay, people are openly talking, and not like quacks, but like incredibly intelligent analysts and former Republican analysts are talking openly about how Trump might have been an asset. Now you have to make the distinction between an asset and a spy. An asset doesn't necessarily mean you're a spy. It means that you're just being played. You're a useful idiot, right? And Scaramucci brought this up, and so did Stuart Stevens. And they basically said, at what point, because we didn't even broach the subject, right? At what point do we start taking seriously that Trump might have been tracked as far back as the late 1970s, early 80s?
Yeah.
Because
and Scaramucci takes it even a step further, right? I mean, he effectively says, "Look, the Russians own him. They own him. Why would he make these steps on Iran?"
So does Stevens. Stevens said it too. He says, like, the KGB was notoriously known for this in their spy. Like they were tracking all sorts of major executives and big businessmen, and and you think about it, right? Like Stevens actually goes into detail and shows how every concession that Trump has made to Putin, like he would speak like if this was like 25 years ago, Trump would have been brought in for questioning. Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, I just think we don't know the details that underlie that, but it's not unreasonable to think that there is something there. And it's not like Scaramucci said, it's not a PP tape. It's not a PP tape. Like that's not,
Scaramucci,
you know.
because it's not a PP tape. I mean, like Scaramucci even brings in details that, like, that go missing in this cacophony of social media. And he says, like, the night of the election, Russian television is showing nude pictures of Melania.
Yeah.
And, he's saying that is a signal to Trump saying, look, we got you. Like, don't think you're going to freaking pull some bullshit here. Okay. Yeah. And look, man, I mean, like, I would even go so far as to say, like, his wife could be part of this kind of tapestry. Okay. Like, and I hate conspiracy theories. I hate conspiracy theories. Right. But, what was that movie? Like, conspiracies are happening when they're happening. When they're true, you know what I mean? Like,
well, maybe we need to have a dedicated episode to espionage or something like that.
Like, I want to throw one last thing into the mix, like the discussion. Yeah. The World Cup is coming to the United States, right? And I don't know if you saw the press conference.
Maybe.
But it was priceless. It was priceless. Yeah. Like, Trump is such a fucking moron. He didn't even realize that the Russians are banned by FIFA. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And then you could see, if you watch the press conference, right, on C-SPAN or YouTube, whatever the fuck you want to go find it on, you can see the wheels in his head's turning, and he actually says, well, we got to find a way to maybe bring them back into the fold.
Yeah.
And like, I'm going, like, what the, like, at what point do we say, oh, this, like send a team to look at this, man?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we know nobody's going to do that now.
The real Manchurian Candidate, man.
Anyways, yeah, for sure.
This was fun. I'm looking forward to next week, man. I'm looking forward to next week.
All right.
Like, next week in particularly, I've already started taking my notes, and I don't know. Let us know, by the way, man. Like, hit that subscribe button, please. You'd be doing us a favor.
Yeah. We should be saying that at the beginning of the podcast. We should be saying it at the beginning of the podcast.
I mean, I actually am foolish to believe, and I'm actually foolish enough to believe that maybe people might like us, and they'll do it voluntarily. But no, man, we kind of like, we want to stay here. If you enjoy us and you want to see us to stick around, and that's one way of helping us. Is just by just click that subscribe button. Tell your friends, pass this on, send it through a link. Say, hey, man, you want to listen to two bozos talk? Well, one bozo. Roddy's a smart guy.
Oh, okay. All right. We got it.
But I mean, I'm like, I think that what's coming down the pike in terms of the things that we have planned to speak about, we have plans to bring in guests. And not big time people, like just friends of ours. And and we want to make this a little bit more spicier, and we hope that you're really enjoying it. Let us know, right? Write a review. A good review.
All right.
Not a bad one.
Yeah, a good review. Good reviews are nice. Okay. All right, man. Take
it easy. Ciao.